All right, man, peace. So, brothers, this is going to be volume 2 in a series that I've recently started called What is Trust? And this edition is going to be featuring Mr. Malcolm Gladwell. For those of you who do not know who Malcolm Gladwell is, he's an author. He's also a sociologist, a societal critic, etc. And he's recently written a book on strangers. And the reason why I thought that this segment would make a great backdrop for a certain topic that I wanted to speak on in reference to brothers is because it would allow me to touch on a series of points that I think are always relevant. And that is the concept of loyalty and trust. When we were children, I'm sure that many of you brothers remember, your mother and or your father would tell you, do not talk to strangers. Why is that? Because as children, we're constantly seeking out connections. We're exploring the world for the very first time. So everyone that we approach, we automatically trust. Children approach everything, whether it's human beings, adults, children, animals, in an attempt to create a connection or a rapport or a relationship with them because we don't understand the world. That's why when people say racism is learned behavior or racism is taught, it's not intrinsic within people. That's a very simple-minded understanding or misunderstanding of why the world is how it is. It's not that children are not quote-unquote racist. It's that they have not reached a level of maturity to understand responsibilities. When you have responsibilities that you have to fulfill as an adult, that means that you need resources to fulfill those responsibilities. In order for you to ensure that you're able to accumulate enough resources to fulfill your responsibilities as an adult, you have to become tribal, because it's only through tribalism that we create structure for the very first time. That is how man created civilization, with the intent of figuring out a way to secure resources so that he can continue to support himself and his family. That is where the concept of quote unquote racism came from, because people organized themselves based on common DNA. And in order to maintain that individuality or that singularity as a nation of people, they tended to shut out others, because within that framework of a nation of people, you have your own culture, not just your own look. So that's where racism came from. That's why I tell brothers, instead of worrying about trying to change the so-called white man or the other races, we have to work on building up the bonds between one another and also the self-confidence that we have within ourselves, so that we're not always validated by trying to force this fake and contrived unity with the other nations, because the other nations are concerned about themselves more than they are the so-called black man and black woman. But let's return back to the topic of this video, that being, how do we interact with strangers? He's going to say a lot of very interesting things. So, of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
Sylvia Plath, the TV show Friends, and Amanda Knox have in common. According to a new book, they can all help us understand why our interactions with strangers often go so wrong. The new book is titled Talking to Strangers.
I've always stated this: when I first meet someone, it's not my job to trust you, and it's not your job to trust me. One of the first things that people do when they first come into contact with one another is they assess what and who that person is, their looks, their personality, the eyes, the smile, or what have you. We're reading all of these cues to try to gauge a person. Me, for example, I have I have a very wild and strange sense of humor. So I don't make jokes with people that I don't know until I understand or gauge what they find funny and what they're not going to find funny, especially around females. I don't really joke around them at all unless I have a real understanding of your tenor, your personality. Are you going to get upset by certain things? What is it that you don't like? What is it that you do like? The same thing with a lot of dudes, because to be quite frank with you, a lot of dudes out here think and act like women because they're raised in a matriarchal system. So I have to understand and be able to gauge exactly who you are. I have to evaluate who your associations are. That's one of the main things that I did when I worked in corporate America. Some of the main things that I wanted to establish as soon as I was on a quote unquote job was, where were the other so-called black men at? And how was I going to go about establishing a strong relationship and a strong rapport with all of them? Because I understand the psychological manipulation tactics that are utilized on the so-called black man in the workplace, and how they categorize him either as the quote-unquote angry black guy or the submissive black dude who smiles all day, who everyone can push around. I always believed that it was part of my job there, the job within the job, to establish those bonds with brothers so that we could see what the nuances were and learn to appreciate the humanity within one another, because the so-called black man is made into a caricature in the corporate America office.
should know about the people we don't know. In it, best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell looks at the harmful impact of not understanding other people and how we can improve. Malcolm joins us now. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I think we should begin by defining stranger. I mean, we're strangers. We said hello in the green room. Yeah. What is a stranger in your view?
A stranger is someone who you either do not know and or do not understand. In the scriptures, there are two different types of strangers. There's someone who's not of your nation, and there's also someone who's of your nation who just happens to be outside of their territory. So even in the scriptures, there are different levels to what a stranger is. The main way that we break through those barriers is to respect the differences first before we look for commonalities, because that's what's going to establish the mutual respect that hopefully can build towards trust. I always say this, especially when it comes to the woman. When you're talking to a chick and you can tell that she likes you, you always have to grasp that the woman, once again, is a child with breasts. So she looks at a new man that she's interested in like a child looks at a Christmas toy on Christmas Day. There's nothing that infatuates a child more than a new toy on Christmas Day. They're obsessed with it. But once they get tired of it, that's when you're going to see the true aspects of that child that are going to last for the duration. It's the same thing with the woman. Many females approach dudes and act like, because remember something, when a woman likes you and she's liked you for a long time, she's dating you in her mind. In her mind, you're her man before she's even met you. So she's going to approach you with this sense of how you're supposed to trust her even though you don't know her. That's always a red flag. A mature-minded woman understands that trust is like any other type of equity. It has to be built up over time. People have to be tested so that you can understand exactly who they are. You're not going to know who someone is until you see how they handle adversity, and especially how they handle adversity with you involved in that adversity.
Anyone outside of your immediate circle of family and friends?
Yeah.
And one of the sort of central arguments of the book is that strategies that work really well with people who are intimate to us don't work so well with people who are outside of our circle. And we need to understand that difference.
And you say the case of Sandra Bland, a woman in Texas pulled over, ends up committing suicide in prison a few years ago, that it's a case study in what can happen when we fail to read strangers appropriately. How so?
Well, actually, that was a case study in what happens when you have two mentally disturbed people encounter one another. And certain people might not like that. But Sandra Bland was mentally disturbed. And then you mix that with the woke mindset. That was a recipe made for disaster. And to take it to a whole other level, it's relatively clear that that was a storyline that was created for the masses to help foment a lot of the racial antipathy that was running rampant in the media at the time. It's very obvious and very clear when you do a little bit of research on Sandra Bland that she seemed to have some level of mental instability. And it's kind of obvious and clear to me, at least, that she may have been a mind-controlled program multiple who was sent out to be a provocateur or an agent of chaos, or her storyline was meant to promote chaos into the mainstream society at large nationwide.
This was one of that string of very high-profile cases a couple of years back of confrontations between African Americans and police officers, and it's the reason for the book. I, like many people, heard about that case, was incredibly moved by it.
And those of you who do not know this, and you might not be able to tell this by looking at Malcolm Gladwell, but he has a Caucasian father and a so-called black mother.
And wanted to write a full explanation of what happens. How can a conversation between a normal police officer and a young woman coming from a job interview in a middle-class Texas town in the middle of the day, how can it go so badly awry that the woman ends up in prison and then ends up committing suicide a few days later?
Allegedly committed suicide. Allegedly. But if you watch the tape of their encounter, it's very easy to see how things could go left so quickly. And I state this repeatedly, and many times so-called black people do not like this. But in the same way that the cops have to utilize restraint when they're interacting with civilians, particularly so-called black men, we have to utilize decorum when we're speaking to the police officers. And there's nothing wrong with that. One of the new things that's in vogue on the internet is people carrying around their phone and trying to antagonize police officers and thinking that their phone is going to keep them safe. That's not going to keep you safe if you're dealing with someone who is mentally disturbed. You should be more focused on maintaining your life and your future than you are in antagonizing police officers, because at the end of the day, there's never going to be a real solution for the level of enmity between the so-called black community and the police, because we're supposed to have our own. And when the so-called black man starts to embrace the ruling class mentality and says to himself, it's my responsibility to act as an administrator over my people, to act as a judiciary figure over my own people, to act as an executor over my own people, and to stop looking towards the white man to be quote unquote fair over a nation of people that are not even his. That's when a lot of my problems are going to go away, and it's going to prepare me to sit on the throne. Brothers love to call themselves kings, but if you're always trying to go back and forth with the so-called white man, how much of a king are you? It really makes little to no sense. But you'd be surprised how quickly a situation can explode when you do not know how to diffuse the situation. It's not just incumbent upon the police to diffuse situations. It's also incumbent upon civilians to utilize enough maturity to be able to extricate yourself from unnecessary confrontations. A lot of these confrontations are unnecessary. And when you watch the video of Miss Sandra Bland, it's very clear that she was charged up from being on the internet and watching many of the altercations that were occurring between police and so-called black people across the country. And she had already decided that that cop pulled her over because she was black, because she was a woman, and she was not going to have it. And on top of that, the police officer was clearly mentally disturbed as well and had entitlement issues. Of course, people are going to say, well, what about the police officer? Are we going to hold him accountable? The only way that we can hold a system accountable is to remove ourselves from that system and form our own. When the so-called black man is ready to do that, then we can have serious conversations.
I wanted to sort of go through all of the ways in which we can misread each other. What are the mistaken assumptions we carry around with us? Are there tools that we're using to make sense of strangers that aren't up to the task?
I always state that respect is the key. Whoever you're speaking to, man or woman, white or black, Muslim or Catholic, Christian, Hindu, treat them with respect. Speak to them with respect. Even if you might not like that person personally, still treat them with respect, because the energy that you emit is going to determine the energy that you get back. And you'll find that the more respect that you treat someone with, the less time you'll have to spend on that encounter. When you're that concerned on making every encounter between a demographic that you don't like an exchange of barbs and insults, it's only going to elongate the encounter. That's why the scriptures tell us that a soft answer turneth away wrath. It tells us to agree with our adversary quickly. That makes them move along. Our focus is supposed to be on ourselves and our families, serving the Most High to the best of our ability, not going back and forth and arguing with random white people because we see oppressors or slave masters and things of that nature. That's something that's imbued within the subconscious of the so-called black man and black woman that they think is a sign of strength. To argue with random white people is really not. Because if you associate a random white person with being a slave master, the operative term or word within that term slave master is master. You associate the Caucasian with being your master, whether you want to understand that, believe that or not. That's why every time you see a random Caucasian, you get so upset, because you associate them with mastery. Therefore, you associate yourself with slavery. That's not empowering. That's demeaning. That's self-demeaning. That's self-denigration.
About race in that direction, though, which surprised me.
I don't, because it's implicit. I mean, of course that confrontation was about race, but what I wanted to do...
Well, I would not say that the confrontation was about race, because I don't think that he saw a black woman when he said that she made an illegal turn. He pulled her over, and it became explosive because she had no idea how to speak to him with respect. And she did not understand that she was speaking to a powder keg in that police officer. So you had two powder kegs coming together to make a huge explosion.
Was to take the conversation one step beyond. Because I feel like in this country sometimes, when we say that something's racial, it becomes an excuse to do nothing more. Mm-hmm. You say, oh, the cop was a racist, and then you say, well, how do you prevent that in the future?
Right.
How do you change someone's heart? And my point is, there is a way to understand this on a deeper level.
Well, one of the reasons why people use the term racial to try to signify that there's no real solution is because the people who are involved in the quote-unquote conversation on race have no understanding of what actual race is. When you believe that race is a color, then you're never going to come to a real solution, because the parameters of the conversation are not legitimate. They're not anything of substance. Those are corporate titles and corporate terms that have been applied on people, white and black, things of that sort, African American. That's not true. That does not denote lineage or origin at all. So there's never going to be a real conversation. That's why so-called black people, deep within their spirit and in their heart, they don't want to go to any other land because they feel like they were planted here. They believe that it's up to the so-called white man to solve their problems for them. That's why when the conversation becomes about race, there's never a solution, because there are very few people in America who actually know what their race is, particularly so-called black people.
Sandra Bland wasn't criminal. She wasn't a criminal. She was just very upset.
Yeah.
No, she was actually very disturbed. And I would expect this from another older liberal black female like Gayle King. We're constantly making excuses for the modern day female and her inability to control herself. We're constantly inundated with the sentiment or with these messages of females or women being equal to men, but they're constantly being held to lower standards. I have no problem with you being held to a lower standard, but that means that you're a lower caliber of being. That's what that means. It's okay if you want to masquerade as an adult, but the only way that you're going to be viewed as an adult is if you're held to the same standard. No, Sandra Bland was just not upset. She was mentally disturbed, as was the police officer.
Point by point, the interaction between Sandra and the cop. People have to read that to get to that, because we've got so many things in this book.
All brothers have to do who have not seen the clip of Sandra Bland's interaction with the police officer is look it up. It totally spilled out of control because both parties had no self-control to begin with. The cop actually had a tad bit more self-control initially than Sandra Bland did. But once he saw that she was not going to treat him respectfully, he decided that he was going to show her the worst version of himself. And because he was the authority, he was able to win.
You say about the truth default theory.
Yeah.
Which is so... I hadn't thought about it until you put it that way.
Yeah.
Explain what that means, Malcolm.
Well, this is an idea from a really brilliant psychologist named Tim Levine, who argues that he was concerned with this problem that many psychologists have been concerned with for years, which is human beings are not good at detecting lies.
It depends on the person. You claim that human beings are not good at detecting lies. It depends on your abilities of discernment. Look, we're all going to be lied to over the course of our lifetime and not be able to detect certain lies. There's no way in the world that we're going to be able to detect every lie. But if you pay close enough attention, you can start to tell when someone is inflating what they're saying or just concocting what they're saying. But sometimes you want to believe what someone is saying because you've made a heavy investment in that person.
Terrible at it. We think we're good at it. We're not. And the question is why? There's all kinds of theories, and his explanation, I think, is the most convincing. And he says it's because we have a default to truth. That human beings, as part of our essential nature, are trusting machines. Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure about that one. He uses the phrase, why do people believe certain lies? I'll use the term, why do people believe certain narratives or stories? And I'm of the firm belief that the reason why people choose to believe certain narratives is because they know that if they refute those narratives, that means that they have to do something that they don't want to do, which is sit back and meditate, contemplate, and figure out what the truth is, which is, of course, an alternative to the lie that they've been told. It's much more difficult to find out the truth than it is to accept a narrative. And that's why people like to believe narratives. That's why they like to believe what they're told by so-called experts, even when the quote-unquote empirical data is not adding up to the summation that is being delivered to you by the so-called expert. It takes much more work to say to yourself, I know that what this person is telling me is bullshit, and I'm going to go look it up. People would rather just lay back on their couch and play the victim role, to be quite honest with you. If you were to tell the average so-called black person, black is not a race, that would make sense to them in their subconscious. And they might even let it creep into their conscious. But it's not going to be something that's going to push them, or at least the average so-called black person, to go further, because that's going to take too much thought. They've already invested too much energy in being quote-unquote black. They've built up this facade or this fake entity, this veneer of being a proud black man or a proud black woman. So if they no longer accept that their race is black, okay, what now? And how do I know that what you're telling me is the truth as opposed to what I've been told my whole life? They're saying those things and they're trying to contest it even though in their subconscious, they're saying, okay, that makes sense. How could color be a race? No other race is really signified by their skin color. Even people that you call so-called white, they tell you, well, I'm Turkish, or I'm Hungarian, or I'm Romanian, or I'm whatever. They attempt to give themselves an actual name or an actual title that would denote their origin. So-called black people are just called black. So it's very clear that there's a reason for that, and that's part of the reason why we don't understand what our history is. And because we don't understand what our history is, we don't know what to do. We don't know what our future is. So that's why I always tell brothers, you have to focus on the scriptures, because the scriptures tell us who we are, who we were, and where we're going to go.
And that when we talk to someone, our assumption is you are being sincere, you are telling me the truth,
Yes.
and it takes a lot of evidence to sort of shake me out of that default position.
Is that why you say face-to-face interactions aren't helpful?
Well, they are helpful, they're problematic. I mean, I think we...
Yeah, face-to-face interactions can be very problematic because you never know how someone's going to respond to what you're saying, especially if it's a truth that is cutting or incisive. But face-to-face interactions tend to bring an air of finality, like it's going to be what it's going to be.
Overestimate how much information we can gather from a face-to-face interaction for this very reason, among other things, because we're very trusting, and also we jump to all kinds of conclusions about.
You also have to understand that with face-to-face interactions, you're going to have a high element of emotion. So that would not probably be the most effective way of communication. Remote communication is always more effective because the listener is forced to take in what you're saying. They cannot overtalk you. They can stop the video or the audio, but they cannot overtalk you. So they're forced to take in the message that you're saying, as opposed to face where things become sensationalized and people can try to combat your message by just being more emotional or louder.
You talk about the Brock Turner case, which you said the Stanford swimmer. Harmless encounter on a dance floor ended up a crime. The reason why this story in particular is so important.
Harmless encounter on the dance floor ended up a crime. That's a nice way to phrase a rape story. I wonder if it was a so-called black man on the dance floor with a female and he ended up with her behind a dumpster, raping her. Would they say that it started out harmless? I guarantee you it would not. They would say that the so-called black man was predatory and he hunted her down on the dance floor, lured her out into an alley somewhere, and just totally ravished her and took advantage of her in her weakened state.
It's about the role that alcohol plays and people don't understand.
Yeah.
Alcohol, especially if you're blind drunk, changes who you are.
No, it doesn't. All alcohol does is exposes who you want to be. That's why people drink alcohol in the first place. This notion that alcohol changes people, no, it does not. What alcohol does is release the inhibitions that they have, so now they can be who they want to be. It's like people say, oh, well, I slept with her because I got drunk, or I slept with him because I got drunk, or I did this because I was drunk, or I did that because I was drunk. You did what you wanted to do, and the alcohol gave you the courage to do it.
Yeah, I wanted to, that's deep in the book. I'm starting to talk about what are the kinds of things that can impair our ability to conduct this very difficult negotiation between strangers.
Because these kids go to parties to meet strangers.
They go to parties to meet strangers. And I think we have underestimated just how, it's more than toxic. It's the presence of alcohol in a conversation between two strangers changes each party's sense of themselves, the decisions they make. It can turn ordinary people into criminals. I mean, it is, and I think that there is a, particularly in the younger generation, they have I think a cavalier attitude towards alcohols.
No disrespect to you, Mr. Malcolm Gladwell, but I would have to find out your relationship history before I take seriously what you're stating about alcohol and social gatherings, things of that nature, because no disrespect. You look like you haven't held a woman's hand since you were in kindergarten and they made you hold a girl's hand. At the end of the day, there are always going to be issues with alcohol or drugs, but they cannot be blamed for human conduct. You chose to over-imbibe. You chose to over-smoke whatever it is that you smoked that quote-unquote compromise your decision-making. Once again, anybody who's had a couple of drinks, all it does is make you more of who you are. If you become an angry drunk, It's normally because you're an angry person who hides it behind fake niceness. A lot of people get a couple drinks in them and they mellow out even more. Why is that? Because that's who they really are.
Dangers that we need to address that.
We need to meet strangers. We don't live in a village anymore. You're going to constantly encounter people that you don't know on a daily basis. If we're getting it wrong right now, how can we get it more right? How can we be better at this?
Yeah, so
just respecting others and respecting yourself. It's really not that difficult. The problem is that people approach others with the misunderstanding of what can I get from this person, as opposed to let me greet this person and introduce myself and go from there. And if we're not vibing, the respect is still always going to be there. As long as there's mutual respect for the next person and you're not concerned about what you can get from that next person or how you can take advantage of that next person, your interactions should be okay. Society should be okay if people led with a certain amount of respect. And that's why I state that's the difference, once again, between a child and an adult. And that's why your parents always told you when you were a child, don't talk to strangers, because the mind of the child is so pure and so unadulterated at that point. They don't really understand the dynamics of life. So everything with them is, how do I initiate a rapport or a relationship or a dynamic with someone or something, a little puppy dog, a little goldfish. Children are the same with everyone that they encounter because everything is new to them. So they're looking for the good in everything. Adults are looking for what they can gain from every interaction. So it's totally different. You can never compare a child to an adult. So once again, when people talk about race and how children understand race better than adults, children don't understand anything because they don't have responsibilities. Therefore, they're not concerned about natural resources. Therefore, they've never been compelled to become tribal.
Last part of the book is concerned, I take the specific example of how police behave. And because that's one of the most consequential, that's a profession by its very nature is about people talking to strangers. Police officers are required to. How can we help them do a better job? And I think that is a really crucial question. And I talk in the book about how we need to give police a lot more, we need to be far more selective in how we use proactive, aggressive police power. We need to use it only in those situations where there is a high degree of probability that criminal behavior is taking place.
Yeah.
The police and every public servant certainly should be held to very high standards of respect, particularly in interactions with civilians. But it's also incumbent upon civilians to know how to speak to other people with respect, including police officers, firefighters, mail carriers, etc. Once you lead with respect, watch how much easier many of your interactions go.
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
Talking to Strangers is on sale tomorrow.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. Peace.